All righty. We are going to be talking about some old guys today. I know this is the Young Man Squad Fantasy Basketball Podcast, which is presented by FanDuel, part of the Old Man Squad Sports Network and part of the Believe Network. But today we're going to be talking about some old guys because they still matter. I know that you obviously get a lot of talk about older players on the Old Man Squad Fantasy Basketball Podcast, hosted by Dan Vespers, but we'll still be talking about them a little bit today with Matt Lawson. So we're going to give our outlook for this upcoming season, which is very relevant for both Dynasty and redraft managers, and then kind of how we project them long term. Some of them are as old as 41 or almost 41, which in the real world obviously isn't that old, but in NBA terms, it's ancient. And then an older player, as in maybe someone that's like 29, 30, somewhere in that range. So generally much older than what we typically talk about on this podcast, or at least typically focus on for this podcast. But we will be bringing Matt Lawson in here in just a moment to talk about them. All right, and we are back with Matt Lawson, and we are going to be talking about, as I said, some older players. We're going to be talking about the old guys. Got a list to go through, and again, this is pretty different from the guys we typically talk about, because we typically talk about younger players on the Young Man Squad Fantasy Basketball Podcast. But Matt, before we get into talking about this list of guys, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. I think that this is actually one of my favorite topics because doing this dynasty analyst stuff for so long, I have kind of come to the other side of it. In the beginning, you're so interested in building out your perfect sandcastle of players who are all exactly 23.3 years old and their time windows are going to perfectly align. And, I started doing basketball dynasty leagues now almost a decade ago, and going back through some of those old drafts of like young teams that I thought I was going to be building, the times where I thought Markelle Fultz and Lonzo Ball were going to be the perfect backcourt duo for me. And that seemed like that was going to happen, when Killian Hayes was the next big thing. This happens year after year that we convince ourselves about youth and potential. And sometimes it hits, and that's when it feels great. But there's so much value in some of these guys that are already productive, that are already winning you fantasy leagues. And there's still a lot of art to picking the right ones. And that's what we're going to kind of try to decipher here today. Which of these guys are on the ledge of being washed and which ones still have real value to you coming up? Because from being in a dynasty league, a lot of these guys can be acquired for a lot less than you would think. It's hard to be able to trade them in a dynasty league. If you roster them and you're trying to pivot to a younger team, there are very few teams in your league who are interested in older players. They don't want to add them to their team. There's maybe like 3 teams in your league who are contending if you're in a 12 team, and probably not that many more, even in like a 30 team, who are really interested in adding a player who's 35 years old to their roster and paying fair value for it. And then even if they are interested, they probably don't have the young assets that you're looking for to being able to pivot for your team. So you have no way of being able to move off of these guys. So many of the guys we're going to be talking about today, you're stuck with if they're on your roster. Or at the very least, you're going to have to sell them below value, but they can still be incredibly valuable to you winning this season. We're going to talk about not only this season for these guys, but how much time do they have left? How much productive time do they have left? And are there warning signs, statistical indicators that the end is coming sooner than we think for some of these players?
It is just a really interesting conversation to have, or just an interesting line of thinking, because you're right. Like a few years ago, I would have been much lower on some of these older players, and they've been playing at an incredibly high level every single season since. I would have had them lower than a lot of guys that are younger just because of the upside. Because you're like, how much longer are these players going to play? And, if you were talking about 10 years ago, oh gosh, I mean, everyone's seen the famous tweet, but like LeBron's 30 now, it's not going to go on much longer.
Right.
But obviously a decade later, and he's still playing at an incredibly high level. I mean, he's going in the second round and on, I think, every platform, or at least most platforms in redraft leagues. He's going to be turned 41. So it's crazy. And then some of these other guys that have had, significant injuries, like a Kevin Durant having an Achilles tear, and he's still playing at a high level at his age. And it doesn't feel like he's just on the cusp of really slowing down to the point where you got to get off him because he might be bad this year. And it's hard to gauge that, because sometimes players hit 29 or 30 and all of a sudden they have some major injury or they just fall off a cliff like really quickly, and sometimes they don't. So it's really hard to gauge some of this. It makes it interesting. You're having to gamble basically every time someone turns 30, which is why they're difficult players to trade in dynasty leagues, and you can get them for cheap if you're really interested, but they're making a huge impact in altering leagues.
We've been discounting LeBron in Dynasty for many, many years now, and he continues to be able to produce. I mean, the availability has finally faded away. That's the big change that's happened. And we'll talk about that a little bit today, that some of these older guys, yes, they're still super productive. LeBron is still super productive, but are you going to be able to get him for 65 or 70 games? Probably not. It's probably going to be lower 60s, in the 50s, even if they don't suffer a major injury. There's just going to be little things that pile up. And that's, I think, the biggest question with a lot of these guys. The productivity on the court is not the question. It's if you're in a head-to-head league and you need to make sure that these guys are available when you need them to be able to win the key matchups late in the season and then to win your playoff matchups, can you feel confident that they're going to be available for you? Not only that they're just going to avoid injury, but that they're not going to be rested during weeks when you need to have them for 4 games and they are only available for 2 of them. Are they going to be able to play on back-to-backs? That's the stuff that I think gives people a lot of pause, understandably, whether in redraft or dynasty, in rostering some of these guys. And I think it depends player to player, and I'm really excited to be able to get into that with each of these guys.
Yeah, and with LeBron, it is an interesting case because I've had him out like just outside or right around the top 100 mark for like 2 or 3 years now, and it's been too low. But at this point, I'm like, well, if I had him here 2 years ago, now he's got 2 extra years of mileage on his legs. How could I bump him up further? I'll just keep him around the same spot. But he's played 70 and 71 games the last 2 seasons. And the couple years before that, he wasn't super available. But now it's like, well, shoot, if LeBron's going to play 70 games again, which I can't bank on for a 40-year-old, but like, what if he does because he's LeBron? So it's difficult to truly gauge that. But we'll get to more LeBron talk in a little bit. The first guy we'll talk about is the guy who's I think I have highest in my dynasty rankings that we'll talk about. That's Giannis Antetokounmpo, who is, let me see if I can get his exact age pulled up. He's on the wrong side of 30 for sure. Exactly. Okay, so he's 30. He'll be turning 31. Pretty interesting guy here because his 9-cap value never lines up with how dominant he is because the poor free throw percentage, lack of threes, the turnovers. But one thing for this season I'm a little bit concerned about is we saw 2 years ago he had one of his best offensive seasons, but he didn't get as many defensive stats. The field goal percentage was down a little bit. Then they introduced Damian Lillard. We see the defensive stats go up. We see the field goal percentage tick back up. What are we expecting from Giannis this year with no Damian Lillard? Not a ton of help. They added Miles Turner, but still feels like the rest of the roster isn't great around Giannis. Are we expecting him to maybe have his best offensive season or like his highest scoring season, but we see some of the other stats tick down a little bit and maybe he isn't quite as impactful in category leagues?
Yeah, I think there's some really interesting questions here, and there's good arguments on both sides of it with Giannis, both for this season and for Dynasty. First, we're talking about him turning 31 years old in December, so we are nearing at least the nearing the end of kind of the true prime of Giannis, and I think this can still be a true prime season for him. It's the shape of what that season is going to take and the durability of that that's going to be the question for him. Let's first kind of look big picture wise. For each of these guys, one of the things that I like to be able to look at for older players is something, if you've heard of the advanced stat Darko, that website, they have, it's still in beta, but it's called their longevity projections. And what this essentially does is it looks at historical lengths of careers, and it looks at how productive players were, the arc of their career. If you've been on Twitter, you've seen it before in stupid arguments on the internet, people putting up Darko charts showing the trajectory of different players. And Darko is an advanced all-in-one metric. You can do it for offense and defense and split it out that way. But Darko itself is an all-in-one metric considered by many in NBA front offices to be one of the best publicly available metrics. So if you want to get an idea if a guy is a winning player, is a good player, Darko is a great all-in-one metric to be able to do that. And Darko has put out longevity metrics to be able to say how many years left on an NBA roster a player has. Giannis, they project to have a little over 7 years remaining on his career. And that's based on how good he is. Players like Giannis can play until they're 38 years old because they're really good when they're 30 years old. And that historically tells you if you're at an MVP level, a guy getting MVP votes every single season, at that age, you probably have a very long career ahead of you. I would pause on that for one thing. I think the closest comp to Giannis as far as the type of player that he is roughly and what the level of player that he is LeBron. So because we're talking about a super plus sized primary on-ball player who is able to have the entire offense run through him, be dominant in transition and dominant at the rim, super physically gifted. We've never seen anything like it until LeBron. And now we have Giannis. They're not exactly the same kind of player. And that difference is why I think it might be an issue. So right at the end of LeBron's career in Cleveland, he finally got his 3-point attempts per game back up around 5. And then since he's been in Los Angeles, he's gotten it up even higher, above 6 3-pointers a game. The 3-point shooting has been a big part of this kind of third act of LeBron's career that has been so successful, kind of unparalleled in its success for a guy playing into his late 30s and now entering his age 40 season. That shooting is what allowed LeBron to, because Father Time is undefeated, lose some of his athleticism. He has lost some of it. He can still bring it out in bursts, but he's been able to continue on being as productive. The box score stats really haven't changed that much because of his ability to be able to stretch the floor. I don't think Giannis is ever going to be doing that. The mid-range shooting last year was a really nice indicator. That does give me hope that he does have many productive years ahead of him. This is going to be one of them. But I don't know if the late 30s are going to look quite the same because I do think he relies on athleticism and brute force more than LeBron does. His style is even more hard charging. Drives are even more important to his game. And drives are one of those things that take a toll over time. It's the reason that Russell Westbrook's career is probably going to be shorter than a player who reached the peak that he did, because similar to Giannis, he depends on athleticism, depends on the ability to be able to get to the rim more so than many other players, almost as much as any other player. And I think that will work this year. It is still a high-risk style of play that is going to subject Giannis, who has had a number of knee injuries, has had a number of lower body injuries. He's going to be susceptible to injury. That could happen. But from a scoring perspective, yeah, he's going to be a extremely high scoring player this season. Basketball Monster projects him for only 61 games. So I think Josh is coming in there on saying like that he doesn't think he's going to be able to hold up under the massive role that he's likely to have in this offense. Because let's be clear, there is nothing else on this team that looks like a legitimate primary on-ball player. They're going to be dependent on Kevin Porter Jr., on maybe Cole Anthony to be able to produce offense, create shots, play make for others in the non-Giannis minutes. Last year, that was Dame Lillard. Dame, everything was about him when Giannis was off of the floor. Giannis's scoring didn't really actually change whether Dame was on or off the floor from a rates perspective. His assists did, and that's why you're going to see a big leap in assists this year from Giannis. There's going to be a big playmaking responsibility on him because he's basically just kind of around a group of shooters who are just going to be waiting at the perimeter for if Giannis kicks it out rather than taking it all the way himself. That's the way that the Bucks offense is going to look this year. It's going to be heavy in transition. They're going to just try to get up and down the court and build everything out of Giannis as much as possible. It will be successful in fantasy for you this year, especially in a points league. He might threaten the top of points leagues this season. I think he's going to be incredible from that perspective. I think you're going to see the defensive stats come down a little bit. I think you're going to see the efficiency come down a little bit. So categories leagues that might balance out a little bit, especially that you always know you're going to be dealing with kind of a punt free throw percentage situation. It's going to be productive, but I think for the long term, there are some red flags that this style of play, which I think is kind of really all that Giannis is going to be able to do in his career with some mid-range thrown in there, it is going to have a shorter window than a LeBron James, kind of the level of MVP level player that we expect to play into their late 30s. I don't know if we're going to get that from Giannis. So I would be considering with Giannis if it makes sense to use one of these great seasons that he has left in the next 2-3 years as an off ramp to be able to reload for your future on your dynasty team.
Yeah, I think this year is actually a great year to do it just because he is the only option. He is going to be doing basically everything for this team. He's averaged at least 30 points per game 3 times in his career. It's the last 3 seasons. He's averaged 6.5 assists is his career high for assists, which he's done in each of the last 2 seasons. He shot over 60% from the field each of the last 2 seasons, but no Dame Lillard, so that'll change. That'll probably drop back down, but we could definitely see him get a career high for both points and assists per game, which obviously, like you said, it's going to work really, really well in points leagues and it will still be effective in category leagues. But we might end up having some of those conversations where it's like people saying, hey, but his 9 cat value is outside the top 100. Giannis is actually having a terrible year. I don't know why you'd want to take him first round in fantasy next year. We could have those types of conversations, but there aren't going to be too many players that are as effective as him. So it may be a good time to move off of him if you have him in a dynasty league. Maybe wait till the trade deadline and then see what you can get. But like you said at the beginning, it's going to be hard to really get a ton of fair value for a guy like Giannis. All right, so the next player that we'll talk about is one of the younger players that I think we'll actually be talking about today. Under a new head coach this year, we're talking about Karl Anthony Towns, who after 1 year under Tom Thibodeau will now be playing under Mike Brown. Are expectations that this is going to look really different for Karl Anthony Towns? I mean, he's coming off his best season after a few down years with Minnesota because Rudy Gobert was in there. Are we going to continue to see him play a significant role? I was looking at the minutes before we did this, and Domantas Sabonis was around 34, 35 minutes per game each of the last few seasons. Cat was at 35 minutes per game this past season. I don't really see a reason why that would change. So are we going to continue to see really dominant numbers from a guy like Cat?
Karl Anthony Towns is one of those players that during his final years in Minnesota, I kind of still held high in dynasty rankings, higher than many people thought that he should have been, because I told people when they asked, when Cat plays center, he's a fantasy monster. And eventually it happened. He got away from Rudy Gobert and he had his most productive fantasy season in many years last season under Tom Thibodeau. Huge minutes, big role. And I think there's some important things to be able to look at for what is coming for Karl Anthony Towns here. He's going to be turning 30 years old in November, so near the start of the season. Darko thinks that he has a little over 6 seasons left on an NBA roster, which is not a lot. This is not projecting like Giannis playing into his late 30s. This is more exiting kind of around his mid 30s. And I think there's good reasons to be able to say that because I think Kevin Love is kind of a good parable here. Love was a fantasy monster who was able to, when he got the opportunity to collect big man stats, was a easy standard league first rounder. He was incredible. Go back and look at the stats. If you don't remember Kevin Love before Cleveland, if you don't remember him when he was in Minnesota, the stat lines were awesome. And Karl Anthony Towns can do that as well. But neither one of them was an effective defensive player. And that's a tough way to be able to have a late career arc as a big man if you are not a good defensive player. You need to be able to shoot it to be able to continue to have a role, which is what Kevin Love eventually did, to be able to stretch the ball out a little bit more in Cleveland, to shoot the 3 a little bit more. But by age 32, Kevin Love's career was kind of already altered. He was no longer a big minute starter. And now we're seeing him probably at the very end. This might be his last season in the NBA. And I believe he just had his age 36 season. So very similar to what they're talking about for Karl Anthony Towns. And I know that's kind of hard to believe, but it would have been hard to believe when you're talking about a 29-year-old Kevin Love as well. We wouldn't have thought that his career would have gone in that arc. I think there's real risk of that with Karl Anthony Towns because he already has been a below average NBA center defensively for years now. I think the New York Knicks this year are going to try to put Mitchell Robinson out there with him. I think Mitchell Robinson might start. I think that is a look that you might see a lot more of this year with Mike Brown as opposed to Tom Thibodeau. But if that's the case, we already know to some extent what Karl Anthony Towns paired with a more traditional center looks like it did with Rudy Gobert. It was a significant hit to the big man stats that really lift up his fantasy profile. And I think that could be the outcome here. So I think it's still going to be a very good season from Karl Anthony Towns. But if he is not the primary center, if he's not playing most of his minutes as the only center on the court, that is going to be a hit to his fantasy stats. It always has been. It will continue to be here. You could see Mike Brown's offense unlock Karl Anthony Towns and the Jalen Brunson, Karl Anthony Towns pick and roll, pick and pop that should be so dominant that wasn't used nearly enough last year with Tom Thibodeau. That could have a boost to his offensive numbers and efficiency. But if more of his shots are being taken away from the rim because Mitchell Robinson is clogging things up underneath, then you're not going to have a level of efficiency on two-pointers that is already kind of an issue for him. And here's where we look at statistical indicators to be able to see if, especially a big man, is nearing the end of their prime. And we've seen with Karl Anthony Towns, his block rate, it did not recover to his old center days in Minnesota last year, even though he was playing as the primary center for most of his minutes with Mitchell Robinson missing most of the season. His block rate stayed the same as it did when he was playing next to Rudy Gobert. That is a big screaming red flag for where his athleticism is at and where his level of defensive ability is at. And part of that was scheme, but part of it has been a trend for him for a while for the way that he plays. We also have seen another big red flag for his athleticism and his career trajectory, and that's the middling rim field goal percentage. He was only 55th percentile, and that's for all players, even worse for centers, in rim field goal percentage last season. That is not something you should be seeing from a 7-footer. It's always been a problem for him. It's getting worse. And if he's going to end up being very quickly a perimeter-only kind of player that doesn't help you on defense, that becomes what Kevin Love has been over the last 4 seasons. That becomes a player that doesn't start quicker than you would realize. So he just had one of his best fantasy seasons, definitely his best fantasy season in a while. I would be looking to be able to cash out on that. I still think he's going to be super productive this year. I would be looking to move on from Karl Anthony Towns before the cliff comes, and you're looking at a player whose career and role in the NBA is very different in the next couple of seasons.
Yeah, and I think it's not just fantasy managers that are going to be thinking that. It's probably going to be the Knicks or other teams as well. He's still got, I think this is 3 years left on his contract, including a player option. I don't think anybody's going to want to be paying $61 million if Karl Anthony Towns is just there to shoot threes in 2 or 3 years. So it's going to get expensive quickly. But this year should still be, at least, maybe not quite as good as it was last year, but still a really nice, productive season for Karl Anthony Towns. The next player that we got here is a player that has had a lot of question marks in Dynasty. People are scared to draft him in redraft sometimes. I think that's been corrected a little bit recently. But Anthony Davis is ready to go for Dallas this year. They're obviously without Kyrie Irving for the first few months of the season. So this team is kind of going to run through Anthony Davis. I mean, Cooper Flagg will be there, and they'll see what they can get out of him early on and just kind of see how good he can be, how quickly he can be really effective. Derek Lively, Daniel Gafford, still like a talented team, reunited with D'Angelo Russell. But really, Anthony Davis is going to be the guy early on this season, or at least that's what I'm expecting. How high can he, I guess, reach for his level of production early on this season?
The questions and the issues for Anthony Davis are pretty similar to what we just talked about with Karl Anthony Towns, but in some ways they're a little bit more pronounced. I guess the first big takeaway, he's a little bit older than Karl Anthony Towns. He's 32 and a half. So by the end of this season, around a little bit after the All-Star break, he's going to be turning 33 years old. That's significant for a big man, kind of a big-bodied center like Anthony Davis. This is not a small guy. This is not a light guy. This is not a guy who has avoided lower body injuries throughout his career. There's a significant amount of injury history here, and that adds up pretty quickly. The knees can go. The body just doesn't move the same way anymore. And the amount of ground that Anthony Davis is able to cover at his size is what has made him so special defensively throughout his entire career. One of the most defensively versatile and impactful big men we have ever seen in the NBA. A truly incredible athlete, pound for pound. I think Anthony Davis is great, but we got fooled, at least some of us, last season by what he had done in the 23-24 season of playing 76 games, being super available. I think a lot of people thought, all right, he's figured something out. But that's not usually the way that this works. There isn't just some secret that a guy wasn't doing, unless it's DeAndre Ayton sleeping on an air mattress, that you can correct in your life to be able to fix your back problems, fix your hip problems. You're going to end up having issues if you have already had them throughout your career, staying healthy. Anthony Davis has always had them. Just go look through the games played log across his career. That's not going to change. And I cannot invest in a guy who, Darko thinks he has about 5 seasons left on an NBA roster. That's a pretty short tenure. That's telling you maybe 2 seasons of what you expect from Anthony Davis left. And I think the only argument would be, well, he's asking to play power forward now, and Nico Harrison's going to do it. He's going to have him play next to Derek Lively or Daniel Gafford. But the problem with that is it's a double-edged sword. Yes, Anthony Davis, maybe his body doesn't take as much of a toll because he's not playing center, but you're not going to get the fantasy stats the way that you're used to getting them if he's playing next to a center. It's the same issue we just talked about with Cat. So you're going to see him get hurt on his rebound and block rates, which are the big reason that he's so valuable in fantasy in both categories and points formats. His offensive rebound rate has been declining across the last 3 seasons. That is kind of a glaring red flag alarm for, declining athleticism in big men. When you start to see that offensive rebound rate, defensive rebounds are usually about scheme. It's just about being in the role to be able to collect defensive rebounds. Offensive rebounds are about talent at rebounding and athleticism. And when you start to see that decline for a player, that's the warning sign that player is starting to decline in their athleticism. There might be an overall decline to their game that is coming. The block rate has been steady. So I'm not saying that it's going to be immediately falling off of a cliff, but when you pair it with the availability issues, I think there's some real concerns for him. And I'd be looking to sell high off of productive stretches, because this season, especially with Kyrie Irving possibly missing all of it, this is going to be a very productive year for Anthony Davis. If he's available and producing, and you roster Anthony Davis, I would use this as an off-ramp to be able to get something more sustainable for the future, because I think we could very much be facing down a future with him where the injuries that he has taken across his career finally take a full toll on him, and he enters a different, far less productive phase of his career.
Yeah, I think Nico Harrison really needs you to tell him that back in January, or else maybe he wouldn't have traded Luka Doncic. But hopefully for his sake, hopefully this works out within the next 2 years so that we can get a really productive Anthony Davis season or 2, and Dallas can compete for a championship. Obviously, that's his hopes and dreams. But I think that like Rob Pelinka did take your advice, whether you told it to him or not, he took your advice and he got off Anthony Davis at the right time, literally right before a massive absence. But obviously when he's on the floor, there aren't too many players that can do what he can do. The next guy we'll talk about is another player that nobody can really do what he does. He is older. He's had injury issues in the past, but it doesn't seem to be a consistent issue for him. That is one of the greatest point guards of all time, depending on who you ask, in Steph Curry. Nobody's hitting threes like him. Nobody's scoring like him. He's improved the efficiency, still providing value in other areas. Is there any reason to expect that to change this year? Are we expecting him to slow down, or do we think his game is just going to age really nicely because he just runs around and hits threes, and nobody's going to be able to stop him from doing that for at least a few more years? Maybe we see some of the other stuff kind of tick down a little bit slowly, but I don't really see a reason why that would definitely happen this year.
Well, if you've been listening to me so far, you're probably saying, Matt, you're just going to keep saying the same thing. It's paint by numbers analysis. This guy is old, so he's going to age quickly, and you should be trying to trade him. I'm going to pivot here. I'm going to zag. Steph Curry, there are no indicators of decline with Steph Curry. There's the gradual decline that we've seen with LeBron James or like a Chris Paul over time. But overall, all the indicators that would tell you for a perimeter player that they're declining, the free throw rate has held exactly at the same level for the last 4 seasons with Steph Curry, still drawing fouls the same way. The drives per game are holding steady season after season. He is doing the same thing. And with Jimmy Butler, he was even more efficient, better finishing at the rim with Jimmy on the court. The assists dropped a little bit because Jimmy had the ball a little bit more, was playmaking a little bit more, but I think that was helpful overall for Steph Curry's efficiency. And that's why you saw those numbers buoyed by the presence of Jimmy Butler across over 500 minutes between the regular season and the playoffs where they were on the court together. So we had a real sample size with the two of them playing. Now, Darko thinks that we could have almost potentially very close to 4 seasons remaining for Steph Curry, which I think is possible. And I know that takes him into being, into where LeBron is about to enter right now, where he's going to be, staring down the door of 41 years old. But if there's a player that was going to be able to do it at his size, it would be the one who has defied expectations at his size for his entire career. The shooting is not going to go away. We saw that in the Olympics. We saw that last season. Steph is going to be able to hit threes probably into his 70s or 80s. I'm not concerned about him being able to continue to do that. And he's moving at a level and takes care of his body at a level where he has put on muscle to be able to handle the ability to play against, NBA athleticism, guys who are physical with him. He answered the bell on that in his career, and he's maintained that level. He's still able to run off of screens all day long without his conditioning being an issue. I don't think that's going to change either, because this is an incredibly competitive basketball player who has answered every challenge throughout his entire career. So I'm very bullish on Steph. I see that Josh Lloyd, a basketball monster, also is. He has Steph at number 7 per game in 8-cat, playing 68 games this year, playing 33 minutes a night. I would be bullish if I had Steph Curry to hold him and just ride it out, because I don't think you're going to be getting the value that you necessarily should for how productive the next 2 or 3 seasons from Steph could be. I think he can do what we've seen from Steph Curry the last 4 seasons. We can have that happen again this year. I think we could happen again in the 26-27 season as well. So if that's going to be valuable to your team, if you're a contender, continue to enjoy the greatness of Steph Curry, because I think we're going to be getting more of it this season and beyond.
Yeah, should be another big year for Steph. If Golden State is going to try and get him another ring, it's kind of going to end up being on his shoulders a good bit, along with Jimmy Butler and the other teammates that Jimmy Butler couldn't remember the names of when he was asked like a month or so ago. Yeah, that sounds like a good sign for sure. All right, we got a handful more of guys to talk about, including a former teammate of Steph Curry who has found a new home. We're going to talk about Kevin Durant, who is now with the Rockets. And I know we've already talked about him a few times over the past couple months, specifically with maybe his role changing, or the role changing really of guys like Atari Eason or Jabari Smith, or why their role won't change. It's kind of been the conversation. What are we expecting from Kevin Durant after a couple years in Phoenix playing alongside Devin Booker? And now I would say he's the best scorer in Houston, but is he going to be prioritized the same way usage wise? Or I don't know, because Amen Thompson is ascending. Fred VanVleet is still really solid. And obviously Alperen Sengun, who we've seen be incredible at Eurobasket and take a nice step forward every year of his career so far. Like, what are our expectations for Kevin Durant this year?
Kevin Durant in Phoenix was a different player, a different role than we've seen from Kevin Durant in some of his different stops. And it was because he really truly did kind of share the ball with Devin Booker to an extreme degree. But there are indicators that every bit of the full lead alpha Kevin Durant as a scorer, as a guy that you can run the ball through to be able to get a bucket at any moment, is still there. And you just need to look at the minutes without Devin Booker. Last season, 729 minutes without Devin Booker. Per 75 possessions, Kevin Durant averaged 32 points. That's over 8 points more than he averaged per 75 possessions with Devin Booker on the court. So he was absolutely dominant at a highly efficient rate, 63% true shooting on 32 points per 75 possessions. This is elite scoring coming from Kevin Durant with Devin Booker off of the court. And I think functionally that's what he's walking into in Houston, is a team where there is no equivalent to Devin Booker on this team. Alperen Sengun's a player who gets usage in the mid-20s. That might even come up for Sengun this year, but he's not Devin Booker. He's not going to be taking the ball away from Kevin Durant in the spots that Kevin Durant wants it. I think they're actually going to be an excellent pairing together. I'm really excited to see those two playing. Just go look and see what Alperen Sengun is doing in Eurobasket this year if you want to be able to add some hype to what this season could look like for Sengun with Durant. And I'm really excited because it was also, you look for free throw rate to be able to see, is a player still able to get advantage and get fouled, with the ball in their hands, to be able to see, did they still have it as an on-ball guy? Kevin Durant jumped up to an elite 9.8 free throw attempts per 75 possessions with Booker off the court last year. So he was a superstar without Devin Booker out there. Still had his fastball. I still think you see his drives per game also increased over the last 2 seasons. He didn't decline in that area. He improved. Every indicator is saying that Kevin Durant this year on this Houston Rockets team, where more is going to be relied on him, is going to be able to jump up back to that superstar level of offense that we saw before his time in Phoenix. I'm really excited to see this season from him. This is another guy that if I'm a contender, I'm looking to invest in these next few seasons. I think he's going to end up with a contract extension with Houston and get a good run. And I don't think there's going to be anything in the Houston pipeline. Amen Thompson is not going to become a Devin Booker level of offensive player or Devin Booker type of offensive player. I don't think Alperen Sengun is going to be taking that away from Durant. So we're going to have this runway of a few seasons in Houston, I think, where Kevin Durant is going to have this late career renaissance as one of the best scorers in NBA history. I'm super excited to see it as a basketball fan, but as a dynasty manager or draft him in redraft, I think I should be extremely excited to be able to see how this unfolds, because every statistical indicator says that we're going to get a couple of prime Kevin Durant seasons coming up.
Matt, that's 2 straight old guys you've talked really positively about. We'll see if we can keep it going with a former Kevin Durant teammate. I guess we're just going to kind of continue going. Maybe I don't think we'll be able to keep that going the whole time, but players that have somehow magically been able to play with each other that are future Hall of Famers. It's kind of interesting how often some of these guys have been able to play together. It makes it fun at times when it works. The next guy we'll talk about is James Harden. And we're not like, for a spoiler, we don't have Kawhi Leonard on this list. And now I kind of wish we did when I made the list, because now we've had something big come up in the news regarding Kawhi Leonard. But we'll stick to talking about James Harden, who saw his scoring go up last season after it being pretty low his first season with the Clippers and a little bit lower during his time with the 76ers. And a lot of that was also after the All-Star break. We saw it tick up. We saw his efficiency tick up after the All-Star break. Norm Powell is gone, but we have Bradley Beal coming in. We have other players coming in that probably won't change too much, but like a guy like a John Collins. We have Brooke Lopez out of day, and we have Chris Paul coming. We probably could have done a whole episode of old guys strictly on the Clippers with the amount of old players they added this summer. But with James Harden, are we worried that the points are going to go back down? Do we think he can kind of still hover around that 20-plus mark with plenty of assists? Are we worried about the usage going down at all? What are our expectations for James Harden this upcoming season?
So it was really kind of 2 different seasons for James Harden last year, both of them really productive and really good. With Kawhi Leonard off of the court, when Kawhi wasn't available, James Harden's scoring leapt up dramatically. We're talking 26 points per 75 possessions, which was 8 points better than it was with Kawhi on the court. And that was 1,900 minutes without Kawhi last season across all games, including the playoffs. The assists with Kawhi, though, were 3 assists better in rates. So he took on a really big playmaking role, was able to facilitate it to Kawhi, 2 others on the team. It was prime James Harden as a playmaker last season. So he was able to kind of flip what his role was and be super productive in both of them. The true shooting was the same in either one of those roles. And without Kawhi on the court, he got to the line back at the old levels, or at least close to that. Maybe not prime Houston James Harden, but pretty close. He was getting to the line 8.8 times per 75 possessions without Kawhi on the court. So he was able to kind of flip that switch and be more of the Houston James Harden, more of the James Harden that we saw with Philadelphia when Joel Embiid was out and not available. He's able to jump between those 2 different types of what his career has looked like in these later stages. And I think that's impressive. And the fact that he was able to do it officially at a really high level last season, it reversed a lot of the bad trends that we saw from him statistically. He had been having a really steady free throw attempt decline for the prior 3 seasons, jumped it all the way back up last season in those non-Kawhi minutes. He was top 10 in drives per game last season, which used to be a huge part of his game, but it had declined over his time in Philadelphia. He turned back the clock. Basketball Monster sees it the way I see it. They've got him at number five per game this year, playing 73 games. Harden's availability has always been one of his best attributes as a fantasy player. He was super available last season. He has largely in his career been super available, played in every game that he possibly can. I love him for this season. I will say with that, though, Darko sees only about 4 years remaining for him. He's got 2 years remaining on his contract with a player option in 26, 27. I would look at that 2-year window this year and next year on the Clippers as kind of being the end of the run. So that's going to be the ledge that you're going to want to be able to get out from underneath. Otherwise, we're going to be moving more into kind of like a late career Chris Paul territory where maybe he's a starter, kind of a token starter on a bad team, or he's, it's like Chris Paul in Golden State where Harden, gets to be a backup point guard and kind of run things, or the way Chris Paul is going to be in Los Angeles this season. That might be what we get in the final years of James Harden. But these next 2 seasons, I think we really could see him like we saw him last year. There was enough positive in the underlying stats to be able to say that he still has it. And he can either be that primary traditional point guard, or he can go back into James Harden hunting matchups, driving, scoring mode that he became so famous for, on his way to an MVP season with the Rockets. So I'm bullish on the short term with Harden, but I'd be looking to off ramp within these next couple of seasons, because I think after that, it's going to be difficult for him to be able to maintain this kind of huge on-ball role as he's entering his late 30s.
Yeah, he definitely fits that same, I guess, kind of mold that we've talked about with Kevin Durant, with Steph Curry, with LeBron. Like, they're still playing at a high level, maybe not quite as high of a level as they were, 5 years ago, which is when James Harden was one of the best players, if not the best offensive player in the league. And NBA teams were trying to figure out new ways to guard him by forcing him to his right hand at half court, because that was an interesting strategy that didn't work. But still, it looks different, but still really effective. Still a high-level player, even if it's not quite that MVP caliber that we saw for a while. So it should still be really fun. 4 more years, that would be getting him to 40 years old. So that would be pretty impressive because not too many players are able to do that, but seeing LeBron and Chris Paul and now more guys like some of the ones we've talked about getting to that point, it's been pretty cool to see. The next guy we've got isn't quite as old as some of the last few players that we've talked about. But Pascal Siakam is in an interesting situation in Indiana with no Tyrese Halliburton this year. It should be kind of the Pascal Siakam show. We got no Miles Turner, no Tyrese Halliburton. So it's like Siakam's the proven guy. And then you have a lot of other players that have an opportunity to step up, get more minutes, and kind of have a big year. But Siakam is going to be the main guy for them this year. He's 31 years old. How long can this last for Pascal Siakam, and are we expecting him to have one of the best seasons of his career?
Siakam has all of the opportunity in the world this season with Tyrese Halliburton not available. The offense is going to have to heavily fall onto his shoulders this year. But let me provide the case against investment in Pascal Siakam in Dynasty, because I think this might be a stay away. I think this might be a really good sell high opportunity, because all the vibes are super positive about this upcoming season. And it probably will be a really high scoring season for Pascal Siakam. But I think there's reasons for pause. Number one, about 31 and a half years old, going to be turning 32 near the end of the season in April. Darko thinks he has 5 seasons left in the NBA, which is pretty low for a guy who's only 31 right now. And I think part of that is that there are some really bad statistical indicators that we've seen in recent seasons from Siakam. His free throw attempts declined from 5.4 to 4.4 per 36 across the last 2 seasons. The drives per game, this is the big one, crashed from 11.5 near the top of the NBA in drives per game 2 seasons ago, down to only 6.2 last season. Now, he's likely to have more of a role doing that this season. We're probably going to see him with the ball in his hands more often, driving to the basket more often, but that is a big decline. That's nearly crashing in half number of drives per game. That's often an indicator of declining athleticism. But if you watch the playoffs, you wouldn't really have said that Pascal Siakam's athleticism was declining. So I understand that, there's a lot of reasons for optimism in the season. He's got 3 years remaining on his contract. There's every reason to think that he's going to just continue to be a big part of this team once Halliburton comes back next season and beyond. But there are some real warning signs here. And part of it, too, for me with Siakam is I think he's better in points leagues where, his scoring and rebounding kind of carry the day for him. That's a big part of his production. But in categories leagues, the free throw percentage hurts you. The defensive stats aren't there, and I don't think they're coming back. That decline has already happened, and it's part of why I think Darko doesn't think that he's going to continue to be super impactful, because of that lack of defensive playmaking, which is often an indicator of declining athleticism, or at least declining productivity on the court for a player later in their career. The overall fantasy stat set is not that great. And I think the efficiency, that is a big area where he's probably going to be taking a little bit of a hit this season, even if he's going to have, I think, the highest usage of his career on this Pacers team. So I think there's going to be an opportunity to sell high. I would sell high here if you had Siakam. I think he's going to have some big stat lines early on in the season. He is a guy who's super available, so if you want to ride it out, I understand. It's going to be a really good season from him, but I think this is going to be the best off-ramp to get off on Siakam, because a lot of statistical indicators say this is a player who's doesn't have much left on his prime years, and that this is a good opportunity to be able to get out before he goes into the next phase of his career, where he's more of a role player, less of a featured player on this Pacers team.
Yeah, and with the change in play style, you mentioned the less drives per game, kind of a indicator of athleticism declining. I guess that could also at least partially be attributed to play style in Indiana, which isn't necessarily going to change all that dramatically with Tyrese Halliburton now. I still think that they play their style of basketball, but I mean, 2 years ago I was in Toronto, and I can't remember if he was there with Darko Rajakovic at all, if it was just with Nick Nurse, but maybe that change in play style could also at least be a partial reason for that dramatic shift, but definitely also at least an indicator of a decline in athleticism as well. All right, got a few more guys to talk about, including we'll finally get to talk about LeBron, which I know we kind of already did talk about him a little bit at the beginning, but is there any reason for you to think that, hey, maybe this is kind of the year that things fall off, or is it kind of something that, like me, you've just been saying for a couple of years now?
Let's start with the positive here before I get into my take on this, because with LeBron, truly incredible longevity, and it's a testament to it that at nearing 41 years old, Darko still thinks he has 3 seasons left on an NBA roster because of how good and impactful he was in his age 39 season. That's awesome. I don't know if he's going to do that. I think that's an interesting question. I don't think this will be LeBron's last season. I think he will play in the 26-27 season. I think it's entirely possible he also plays in the 27-28 season. It's hard to imagine it beyond that, but that might be part of what he's trying to build for his legacy, to be able to build for his historical case as the greatest player of all time, of how late into his career he was still able to play and be impactful. And I think the pivotal thing on what the final seasons of LeBron's career look like comes down to the reality of Luka Doncic now being on the Los Angeles Lakers. Because last year, without Luka, it was a vintage LeBron season in so many different ways. There were some issues defensively at times, but then he would come back and he'd look like himself. There was some times where we thought, oh, he's washed now, and then he'd go right back to pivoting to being just as productive as ever. And without Luka on the court last season, it looked exactly like it has looked like for LeBron during his Los Angeles Lakers tenure. With Luka, it was a dramatic decline in points, assists, rebounds, and the overall, and his efficiency improved a little bit, but not enough to be able to accommodate for the kind of like lack of productivity with Luka on the court with him. So I think that we are going to see that decline from LeBron with Luka this season. That's going to continue. That trend that we saw last year across the regular season and playoffs will continue. He's not going to be as productive in points, rebounds, and assists. It is going to cause a big hit there because the workload is going to be smaller. That might allow him to stay on the court more. That's the real hope, that we're going to continue to be able to see LeBron playing full seasons like he did last year for the most part. And I think that we're going to see the continuing statistical trends that we've seen so far, which is a big drop in free throw attempts, went from 5.8 to 4.9 per 36. Drives per game has been steady, which is a nice indicator, but we're seeing the gradual decline of a player who is in his 40s, but still in all NBA consideration, which is almost unheard of in NBA history. So we'll give him credit. We'll tip our cap, but I do think we're going to see what we saw, the trend that we saw last year when Luka came on, of LeBron's stats dipping a little bit. Basketball Monster sees it in a similar way, having a number 29 per game in 8 cat, only 61 games, but still playing 34 minutes per night. He's going to be out there like he was last season, it's just not going to be as productive with Luka there with him.
Yeah, and our partners at FanDuel have a great way to put your money where your mouth is if you think that LeBron is just going to keep chugging along the way that he has been. As I think everyone kind of knows that follows basketball, he scored at least 10 points in 1,292 straight games. Yeah, so you can actually go ahead and get on FanDuel and bet whether or not you think LeBron will maintain that streak of scoring at least 10 or more points. It is minus odds, minus 148 that he will, plus odds plus 116 that he will not. So if you are a believer that LeBron is at least going to go get his 10 and keep this streak going, you can check out our partners at FanDuel and bet on that line. Got a few more guys to talk about here, and I think that we're probably going to end up leaning more on the negative side of these two. I mean, if you have a positive take, I would love to hear it, but I'm probably a little bit more pessimistic about them, specifically the last one. But first, we'll talk about DeMar DeRozan, who his longevity, I think, is kind of gone underrated because of the amount of players that have had recent just huge longevity success stories, like some of the players that we've talked about, which, I mean, we talk about that with Chris Paul sometimes. It's like his longevity goes under the radar because LeBron's been better and doing it just a little bit longer. With DeMar, it's like, okay, Steph has been playing at a higher level for just as long, but DeMar's been really, really consistent for over a decade. Are we expecting him to just kind of staying consistent, or is Sacramento going to be too much of a mess for that to happen? Is he the number one option? We saw his assists go up after the All-Star break, which was, after they traded De'Aaron Fox. Does that stay consistent? Is he still a primary playmaker here, or does Dennis Schroeder come in and change that?
It's truly wild with DeMar DeRozan because we're entering his 17th year in the NBA, and I think he's been counted out by, calculator rats, stat nerds for almost the entire time. But he's continued to find a way to be able to reinvent himself over and over again and become a player who now has, I think, a borderline Hall of Fame career for what the Basketball Hall of Fame allows in. I mean, this is a guy who's made 6 All-Star teams, made All-NBA teams, I think 3 different times. He has had a really strong career. And part of that is he went from one of the most tunnel vision non-passers you've ever seen in your life early in his career in Toronto. We're talking about in his rookie season averaging 1.1 assists per 36 minutes. I mean, like, just abysmal passing, no recognition of any teammates around him, to a guy by the time that he was done in his last season in San Antonio averaging 7.4 assists per 36 minutes. So a complete transfer shooting never came around, but it didn't matter because of the mid-range mastery, because of his improvement as a ball handler over his time in the NBA. He just continued to find ways to be able to be productive. Not the best player, maybe not the most winning player, but certainly a really good one. And with those flowers given, let me tell you, get out from DeMar DeRozan immediately if you are rostering him in Dynasty. Don't touch him in redraft, because the statistical indicators right now are telling us that not only is the ledge coming close for DeMar DeRozan to be washed, he already drove over it last season. We saw his steals fall off dramatically last season in Sacramento, as did his efficiency in the second half of last season. The free throw attempt rate dropped off from 7.4 per 36 to 5.7, which is a big age decline indicator. There are just so many red flags here. Even if you're still going to get kind of helpful points and free throw percentage and assists from him, moderately helpful in those categories, but that's about it. The other categories, he's going to be a negative, not helping you. And you could easily see a more pronounced decline after last year's drop. His drives per game, we just talked about this with Siakam. This is a big one for DeRozan, because in the 23-24 season, near the top of the league at 14.8 drives per game, last season down to 9.5. So that's a dramatic drop off. There's so many statistical indicators saying that this is the end of the line for DeRozan. And this is a team that I think is going to be a disaster for who has the ball, who's getting the shots. I don't think it's going to work. I do not see the vision of the roster construction here. I can see DeRozan wanting to get out of this team, but his contract with 2 seasons left is going to be difficult to be able to move, especially If he is already washed the way that the statistics are indicating that he might be, this is a stay away. This is a sell before the season starts. If you have DeRozan rostered now, there's screaming red lights telling us that this is not a player that you want to continue to roster in any format.
Yeah, I'm also a little bit, like I said, pessimistic about these last two guys that we'll talk about. Not sure exactly what is going to go right in Sacramento this year. I feel like I'm almost missing something, that they haven't made more moves or more changes that they haven't, but maybe it is just that nobody wants to take on any of the contracts that they have. So maybe they'll just continue to be fighting for play-in appearances, just like Chicago West, which is exactly what they wanted to be doing, was being the Bulls of the West. One more guy to talk about, and not a guy that you're probably going to be interested in trading for. And I do wonder if this is kind of almost like an opposite situation where his value is probably so low right now that maybe you're able to trade for him for low, because if you have him, you're probably not going to be able to move him and get any value back. And that's Paul George, who, yeah, the last season went really, really poorly for him in Philadelphia. When he was on the floor, he wasn't good. I've seen him. I'll pull up his ADP while we're talking, but like, it's pretty dramatic how much it's fallen off. 75 on Yahoo, 76 in Fantrax, and 90 on ESPN for a player that we know can be, or has been in the past, for most of the past decade at least, a top 25 per game player. But obviously his first season in Philadelphia was abysmal. Is there any hope for someone that has him on their roster that Paul George is going to maybe not get back to what he was, but be a productive player next season?
You know, I'm a positive guy. I mostly don't like to try to bury people. So let me start out with some compliments. Paul George, one of the smoothest 9-category fantasy stat sets of his generation. This guy's like lived in standard league, like back end first round, you know, like early second round production for, you know, it seems like forever. And now we saw even last year where there was a disaster season for Paul George. Nothing went right. Still like right around like top 50 in fantasy production last season per game. So even when it's bad, it's still pretty good because the fantasy stat set is so good. It's going to rack up a ton of steals in Nick Nurse's defense this season. That's what he does anywhere, but especially with Nick Nurse, it's easy to be able to do, as we've seen with guys like Gary Trent and Tyrese Maxey, who suddenly have like these massive steal rates playing for Nick Nurse, because that's how his defense operates. It's the level of aggression that they have jumping passing lanes. I think that there's something to that if Paul George can get on the court, but let's be clear, we're coming into a season where he just had arthroscopic knee surgery in July. This is a guy who kind of picks and chooses when he's available, when he's just going to prioritize podcasting over playing. I don't know if we're going to get Paul George at the start of the season. I don't think if Paul George knows if we're going to get Paul George at the start. I would bet we don't. And I think it might be a little bit of time into the season before he's ramped up. And then who knows if he's going to be able to maintain being on the floor at that point, or how Philadelphia's season goes with Joel Embiid's availability also in question. This could be a full pivot into play the young guys. This just isn't working if it looks like Paul George isn't going to be able to be healthy this season, which is entirely possible. Now, the statistical indicators are not great for Paul George either. We're talking about a free throw attempt decline over the last 3 seasons of going per 36, 5.5 down to 4.2, down to 2.6. So it is cratered his ability to be able to draw fouls and get to the line. That is a real concern and a real indicator that things are not going in the right direction. I just don't trust him to be able to be available. I think there might be some window to be able to flip him, but no one's going to want to touch him. The vibes are awful around Paul George. It's kind of, especially in Dynasty, it's going to be toxic. So this is a stay away for me, unless you just want to get bargain bin price. Someone's just willing to give him up for nothing in your league, and you're willing to be able to take that flyer because the price is so low. But investing anything real into Paul George at this point seems like fool's gold. The only thing that holds on to the idea of him having more time left in his NBA career that will be productive is that there's 3 seasons remaining on his massive contract. 27-28 is a player option that, let me guess, he's probably going to be picking up. So I think you're looking at the reality of him being in the NBA those next 3 seasons, and that might be it. And it might be one of these situations that we're seeing increasing where an NBA team, whether it's the Sixers or somebody else, they're going to be stretching him just to be able to get it off of the books if he can't get things back on track. There will be opportunity because of that contract for him to get opportunities to play this season, play next season, because you can't pay a guy that much money in the NBA and just not have him be available and still have that be a viable NBA team. So that is one reason for hope, but every other indicator, every other bit of news that we're getting says this is stay away from Paul George in redraft and in Dynasty unless you're just getting him for a song. That's the only reason that you would do it, just to be able to take a flyer. Anything above flyer prices, I'm not touching it.
Yeah, I don't have anything positive to add, so we'll just go ahead and wrap this episode up and say, hey, we're probably not going to talk about Paul George again on this show because there really isn't a reason to. Matt, before we go, as always, thank you for hopping on and talking about some old guys with me. What do you got coming up? Where can we find your work?
Yep. All my work, all my rankings, trade calculators, rookie rankings, everything they could be looking for points and categories leagues, available at patreon.com/NBA Dynasty ADP. You can get a free trial, try it out for 7 days, look at everything, have everything available to you. And if you don't like it, then you can cancel it. I just want to be able to make resources available to as many people as possible to make Dynasty basketball the best experience possible. That's why I love doing these shows with you, Noah, because it's an opportunity to be able to make Dynasty more accessible, more enjoyable for people by providing the analysis and resources that are sorely lacking in this area of fantasy, the best way to play fantasy basketball, in my opinion, Dynasty. So check me out on Twitter at NBA Dynasty ADP. You can get links to everything through that. Check out my Patreon, see if it's worth your while. Going to be having new Dynasty rankings coming up. I've been holding off, like assuming that we're going to get more than just Cam Thomas signing the qualifying offer, that we might get these final pieces of things. But I think I'm just going to have to press forward because at this point, it seems like Jonathan Kuminga, Josh Giddey, Quentin Grimes, at least the time of recording right now, are just in permanent deadlock with their teams. We'll see how that ends up phasing out. I can't wait to get some of this training camp news to be able to get preseason. I love preseason basketball. I know people don't watch it. They think it's a joke, but you learn so much about what teams actually think about some of their players. And it's always surprising. No one pays attention to it. And that is like the best way to be able to get the advantage over your league. If you actually pay attention to what teams are telling you about their rotations, we're going to be all over that in the coming days. I can't wait to get into it. We're so close. I've been like funneling Eurobasket television as much as possible, just gobbling it up. It's been fantastic. I love watching a bunch of guys who aren't athletic enough to play in the NBA just cutting around everywhere and playing their hearts out. It's like the college basketball version of professional basketball. And got, blast from the past of guys who just never worked out as drafts and stashes. It's fantastic. I love hoops. I know Noah does too. We love doing this with you all. Noah, thanks for having me on. Can't wait to keep doing it as we go forward into future weeks. And we are getting close, man. A little bit over a month away from real basketball.
100%. Yeah, it's kind of crazy how quickly the offseason has gone by, but that's a good thing. We're excited to get back to real basketball. We will include a link to Matt's Patreon in the bio for this episode, so be sure to check that out. Give him a follow. But that's going to do it for this episode of the Young Man Squad Fantasy Basketball Podcast, which is part of the Old Man Squad Sports Network and Believe Network and presented by FanDuel. We'll see you next time.